So while America appears to be barreling towards an autocracy, I think it's important for us to spend a little bit of time just briefly examining what exactly it is that constitutes, that is the fundamental sort of cornerstone of an autocracy. What keeps an autocracy alive? What is the main characteristic of an autocracy that separates it from a democracy and other forms of government? And what is it, therefore, that leads to its eventual demise? What is the actual part of the autocracy that when you remove it, the autocracy will crumble? I'm going to talk about that in this video, right after a quick word about the channel. I hope you're enjoying the video. As a psychiatrist who's fascinated by the worlds of politics and economics and philosophy, I love making these videos, and if you'd like to see more of them, then please do like and subscribe and comment in this video. What you'll find is that there's a beautiful community growing up around this channel. We're all going through a national and international trauma right now because of what's happening and where our leaders are taking us. And in this channel, you'll find people honestly sharing their situation and their distress, and other people responding with kindness, empathy, and compassion. So please join this wonderful community that we're forming, join in the comments and the dialogue that's happening. Now, the key characteristic of an autocracy, the fundamental foundation of an autocracy, is the way in which the ruler, the leader, uses the armed forces and law enforcement almost as if they are fused to his body. It's like they are limbs that belong to him. Okay? So the dictator essentially uses the armed forces as entirely something that he can utilize at his whims. So there is no actual rules of engagement, there are no protocols around their deployment. He essentially can activate them whenever he chooses to do whatever he wants. So they are servants of his. So seeing the military and also law enforcement as directly reporting to him as appendages of his own is the way in which an autocrat can act as an autocrat. They have to stand and sit down and do whatever he says, because that power, the power of the gun, can overcome and overwhelm every other power. Because once you have the power of the gun in totality on your side, then the courts and even other democratic checks and balances, houses of parliament, etc., Senate, Congress, none of them really matter, because you can use the weapons to essentially override and overwhelm everything else. That's what eventually happens with all autocracies. They will eventually park the tanks outside Congress, they'll park the tanks outside, they'll threaten courts and judges. So they'll do all of these things in order to use that power to usurp every other power base there is, including the media and every other kind of a state. Now that is clearly what Donald Trump is doing right now. So this weekend we see this farcical military parade that he's engaged in to fete him on his birthday. To celebrate Donald Trump on his birthday, the US military are coming out to parade in front of him. This is part of his control strategy. It's part of his instinct to be the one who holds the military as if they are his arms and legs. So in the same way that his children might come out to celebrate him and his grandchildren might come to his house in order to celebrate his birthday, the military are the same. They're like his children, like his grandchildren, like his offspring, his progeny, who will basically respond to all of his whims and do whatever he wants. And that's the purpose of this parade, just to make it look like they're completely subservient to him. Now, again, I stress, Donald Trump doesn't do any of these things strategically. He's not sitting there and calculating, yes, if I do this, then it'll have this effect. He's an instinctive authoritarian. As I've said before, he has this sort of reptilian reflexes that make him act like an authoritarian, like a crocodile has reflexes to essentially, drown and eat its prey. So it's the same thing, and those reflexes are leading Donald Trump to essentially subjugate the military, to make them almost subjects of ridicule, so that he is the one who is shown to have total control of them. I tell them to come out in front of me and march up and down the street, and that's what they're going to do right now, because it's my birthday, right? So this military parade is part of that process of subjugating the military, of making them pieces of him. Now, what you then also want to do is utilize the military to quell and diminish and ultimately destroy any other centers of power. That's military, law enforcement, anything else you have. And again, that's what we see they are doing in the Trump administration. That's exactly what happened to Senator Padilla from California just this week. The disgusting, disgraceful scenes of his restraint, like a common violent criminal, at the hands of Kirsty Noem and her sort of protection detail.
And balancing. Sir, hands up, hands up. I'm Senator Alex Padilla. I have questions for the Secretary, because the fact of the matter is a half a dozen violent criminals that you're rotating on your
I also want to
hands up.
How many of our ICE agents have been docked?
On the ground. Hands behind your back. Hands behind your back.
If you don't my hands, go ahead, put them behind my back.
All right. Cool. One hand. Lay flat. Lay flat.
Other hand, sir. Other hand.
There's no recording allowed out here. I did not know. There's no recording allowed out here.
So here we see a powerful individual, one of only 100 senators in the US, treated like a criminal, restrained and overwhelmed by force in that way. So again, this is an example of using military power, using armed force to destroy other centers of power. And that's exactly what started here. Now, there were many senators who came out on the Senate floor to very powerfully articulate their disgust at this Rubicon that had been crossed.
We are robbing the ability of every single senator to do our job if we are now going to be threatened with violence when we simply try to stand up for our constituents.
Speaking out, asking questions, getting information so we can be their voice. What happens when that voice is stifled? What happens when that voice is thrown to the floor and handcuffed? Our democracy is lost.
He was put in handcuffs for asking a simple question. He was put in handcuffs for doing his job as a United States Senator. He was put in handcuffs for standing up for the Constitution of the United States. He was put in handcuffs for representing the people of California.
One thing, however, that was notably absent from these speeches in the Senate was representation from Republicans. There are almost no Republicans in the Senate at all, even listening to the speeches. So subservient have they become that they can't even speak out when one of their own, when one of their colleagues is pushed to the floor by the president's administration. So they are already on the floor, you see. That's why they're not speaking out, because they are already groveling on the floor, crawling on their bellies before the president. So he's already subjugated them. Now, because he hasn't morally and politically subjugated the Democrats in this way, he's physically subjugating them and actually pushing them to the ground, using his power that way. So it all boils down to the way in which the military and the armed forces and the law enforcement, all of these forces that exist within America are essentially tools of his. And that's what he's trying to demonstrate both in the parade and in the way that Senator Padilla was treated. Now, of course, in any normal circumstance, this would lead to the resignation of multiple people. It would lead to the resignation of people in that security detail. It would lead to an apology from the president himself. It would lead to the possible resignation of the cabinet secretary too. None of that happened. There's not even any question of that happening. Okay? Because why? Because they approve of this. Because that's their modus operandi. Using force to extinguish power. Any power that exists outside that of the autocrat himself. Now this takes us to contemplating now how this power is eventually removed. What happens when an autocracy is dismantled? Because it's happened throughout history, right? We've seen many autocracies that have been brought down. And how are they brought down? Well, they're usually brought down by one thing, and it involves the same thing. The forces, the armed forces, the military, the forces of actual might that exist within a country. And what happens is that the demands on them are escalated and escalated. They're asked to do more and more for the autocrat, and eventually they say, no, we're not going to do this. Actually, you know what? We side with the people. They only need to say that once, and it's over. I'll give you an example, okay? I've talked before about Ukraine. I might mention that again, but a really good example here is Romania. But we can give other examples. We can talk about Gaddafi and Libya. We can talk about lots of other autocrats who've been completely destroyed by this process. But let's look at Romania because it's very interesting. See, Ceausescu was an entirely corrupt dictator of Romania, and he had stolen vast amounts from his own government and his own people, and completely retained power with a secret police by using the military, using the army to do all of his bidding and give nobody else any power or any say at all in the country. And at one point, people were so overwhelmed by him, and he knew that he was becoming unpopular. There were protests in the street against him. He quelled them down with armed rebellion, and then he insisted on having a big audience in front of him to listen to him give a big speech in the sort of main capital centre, a main square in Bucharest. And something very interesting happened there. So he stood up and gave a speech to the whole crowd of tens of thousands who had been forcibly assembled there, basically, and they all kept completely silent. The only applause were coming from speakers that were just underneath his podium to make it look like people were applauding and cheering, but nobody actually was. People were standing there furious and quiet. And then what happened is they started to storm the Capitol building. They started to storm the building he was in, the sort of federal building, and they then got the military to push them back. And later on that night, he then got the military to pursue the crowd and shoot at them. And there was a bloodbath, and hundreds of Romanians were killed on the street. In fact, so bad was the bloodbath that they needed a whole force of cleaners to come out the next day to wash the blood off the streets. Okay, that's the extent to which he then got the military, again, to act as his own appendage, to act as entirely his servants, and kill hundreds of their own citizens in order for him to retain his power. It was at that point that the next day more people came out onto the street. Rather than fleeing, as I've said before, if you looked at my previous videos, I gave the example of Ukraine in which something similar happened, and at that stage, millions of people came out to the streets. So it's up to the people to then continue their defiance. That didn't happen in Russia, when Putin has put down protests before. People stayed home, which is why Russia remains an autocracy now. But in Ukraine, people came out into the streets, and in Romania, in this example, then more people came out to the streets. Millions of people came out to the streets. And the effect of that was that what it led to was the military, rather than deciding, we've killed hundreds, now we're going to kill thousands and tens of thousands, actually the military stood down and said, no, actually, we're not going to. And this has happened time and time again. As I say, it happened there in Ukraine, it's happened in Libya, it's happened in many countries around the world. The military eventually have to stand up and say, no, we're not doing this now. They obviously felt terrible at having killed hundreds of their own citizens, okay? Many of whom could have been people they knew or were related to. And essentially the military could not take it anymore. So they defied Ceausescu and they did not follow his orders. At that moment, those limbs that he believed he had became severed. They were no longer his. He was no longer in charge of the military. The military had to stand up and refuse orders. And at that moment, the autocrat becomes a nobody. And he was hounded by his people, eventually arrested and killed. As I say, same happened to Gaddafi. You can look at other tyrants throughout history. Eventually, the military will snap off, because these are brittle limbs that the autocrat holds, because he doesn't give them any flexibility, he doesn't give them any power, there's no feedback, there's no reciprocity, there's just hierarchy. You do what I tell you to, you're like robots and automatons, I switch you on and you do as I say. And because they're brittle limbs, at some point they'll snap off. So when the military snaps off, that's when it ends. And that, unfortunately, is the climax to which this is heading. It will go to stages where the military are deployed more and more inappropriately. We've seen only this week, where he's tried to deploy the Marines in Los Angeles. He's then actually had one of his administration's security detail restrain a US senator and physically manhandle and floor him. So we've seen him using his power and his administration using their power in different ways. They're building up to the point where the military will be used more and more against the people, and hopefully the American people, with a spirit of independence in which that country was found, will step forward and come out in larger and larger numbers and require the military to escalate its response higher and higher, to the point at which the military says, no, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to kill that number of citizens. In fact, we shouldn't be killing any. And at that point, his chain of command is broken, his power is over. And at that point, he becomes court-martialed. I really think it's going to get somewhere like that. This, I think, is what we can see happening before our eyes with this parade, with this disgusting treatment of a US senator, with the attempt to deploy Marines in a US city, is trying to make the military as appendages of Trump. And eventually, the only way he comes down is when that snaps off. So even in the creation of Trump's autocracy, we can already see how its demise might come about. I hope you liked the video. I hope you also can join me with more of my content that I'm aiming to make over the coming months and years. You see, this time around, what we're experiencing in this administration is a global trauma, and the people going through it have been asking, how can we support ourselves? How can we learn and grow and share together through this process? So I've started to write a series of ebooks. That's, together with my whole team, once a month we're going to produce an ebook to help us understand better the psychology of the people around us and the systems we're in, as well as our own psychology too, to help us navigate this increasingly confusing and disorientating world we find ourselves in. You'll be able to find those books on russellsbooks.com. That's russellsbooks.com. As soon as you go there, you'll be able to see the growing catalogue of books and hopefully buy any of them at any point. In addition, I hope you can subscribe to my e-newsletter. See, there's a link in the description of this video and also the description of the channel. And if you go there, you'll be able to fill out a form. Once you've completed the form, you'll then be able to get subscribed to my e-newsletter. And that way you can always be kept up to date about the content I'm producing. You see, the fact is that this platform, as well as all platforms, are owned by a very small number of oligarchs. And at any point, they might decide to shut down a channel like this. And if they do that, then, well, it's going to be hard for us to keep connecting. So if you sign up for my e-newsletter, that way you'll be able to make sure that you'll be informed about my content wherever it's delivered and wherever it lands. Finally, I hope you might also consider becoming a member of the channel. If you do, you'll get these ebooks for free every month. So all the ebooks I produce go free to my members who join the channel every month. Also, you can get priority response to comments, and there's also a members-only chat page for higher-level members that we engage in regularly to sort of learn, share, and support one another. As I say, this is a difficult time, it's a traumatic time in history, so many of us need support from each other. I'm hoping each of these things can help all of us create a better tomorrow together. Thank you.